In February 2011, Aaron Rodgers stood in the middle of the field while confetti rained down and the Lombardi Trophy sat firmly in his hands. The entire football world felt convinced they were watching the start of a massive dynasty because he was only 27 years old and had just dismantled the Pittsburgh Steelers.
Rodgers on the move. Touchdown, Packers!
He finished the regular season with 28 touchdowns and went through the entire playoff run with a 9-2 TD to interception ratio. However, after the next 12 seasons, he still only had one Super Bowl win. He did manage to pick up 4 MVPs, but his era seemed like a disappointment in Green Bay. Why is that? That we're going to go over in this video. Rodgers spent 3 long years behind Brett Favre, and it was never a warm relationship. Favre famously told the media that it wasn't his job to babysit, and that made their relationship rocky from the start. Rodgers watched and learned while he waited for his turn, but when he finally got the keys to the offense in 2008, the team finished with a disappointing 6-10 record. He put up 4,038 yards and 28 touchdowns, which was solid for a first-year starter, but there were no playoffs and no real sign of greatness that was coming. The real leap happened in 2009 when Aaron threw for over 4,400 yards and 30 TDs with only 7 interceptions. Green Bay finished 11-5 to make the playoffs for the first time with him under center, but they lost to Arizona in overtime during one of the wildest games ever played. Rodgers threw for 433 yards and 4 touchdowns to bring them back from down 17 points. Yet the game still ended on a strip sack fumble return for a score. They were out of the tournament, but you could finally see how high the ceiling was going to be. Everything changed in 2010 when the Packers entered the playoffs as a 6th seed with half the roster sitting on IR. Rodgers carried the entire team on his back, starting with the 48-21 blowout of the top-seeded Falcons in the divisional round. He survived a physical battle with the Bears in the NFC Championship game, and then in Dallas, he carved up Pittsburgh for 304 yards and 3 touchdowns. He won the Super Bowl MVP and got his ring, and the job was officially done. The crown had finally passed from Favre to Rodgers, and it felt like the start of a long era of winning. Instead of wondering if they would win again, everyone was just trying to guess how many more trophies they would collect. The 2011 regular season is the type of year that makes you realize you're witnessing greatness in real time. Aaron Rodgers was playing out of his mind, throwing 45 touchdowns against only 6 interceptions while putting up a 122.5 passer rating. That number actually broke the all-time single-season record at the time. Green Bay finished the year 15-1, and their only loss came against Kansas City in a game that felt like a total fluke. By December, the media was already writing pieces about the next great NFL dynasty. Everything seemed to be lining up perfectly for another ring. Rodgers secured his first MVP award, the Packers locked up the top seed in the NFC, and they were set to play at home against a 9-7 Giants team that basically stumbled into the postseason. Green Bay entered the game as massive favorites, especially considering they had won over 13 straight regular season games at Lambeau Field. Then the actual game started, and they lost 37-20. Rodgers finished with a 78.5 passer rating and threw for 264 yards with 2 touchdowns and a pick. But the real issue was how the offense just went cold when it mattered the most. New York's defensive line lived in the backfield all afternoon, and Rodgers never looked comfortable in the pocket. However, you can't pin the entire disaster on the quarterback because the defense was softer than tissue paper. The Giants hung 37 points on them in the freezing January cold at Lambeau. Green Bay handed the game away with 4 turnovers, and while the Giants eventually beat the Patriots in the Super Bowl, that doesn't excuse the result. The most frustrating part of this loss is how the organization handled the fallout. Instead of fixing the obvious holes, the front office basically did nothing, and the defense remained middle of the pack for the rest of the decade. You could try and diminish the Giants' collapse as a one-off event where the ball just doesn't roll their way. One bad day at the offense doesn't usually define an entire era of football, but the problem is this was never just one day for the Packers. The 2012 season followed the exact same script. Rodgers was still elite, throwing for 39 touchdowns and leading the team to 11 wins. But then the playoffs happened and Colin Kaepernick showed up and ran for 181 yards against them. The 49ers walked away with a 45-31 win in the divisional round that wasn't nearly as close as the score suggested. Green Bay's defense had no answer for the read option, and San Francisco moved on to the next round without even breaking a sweat. Things got even more stressful in 2013 when Rodgers broke his collarbone against Chicago in Week 9. He missed 7 games while the Packers struggled to a 2-5-1 record without him, leaving them in a win-or-go-home scenario in the final week. They had to go into Soldier Field against the same team that knocked him out just to sneak into the dance. With the season on the line in the fourth quarter, Aaron rolled to the left on 4th and 8 and launched a 48-yard bomb to Randall Cobb for the game-winning touchdown. It was a legendarily clutch moment that clinched the division and reminded everyone why he was the best in the world. But the celebration didn't last long because they drew San Francisco again in the wildcard round and lost. Rodgers was held to 177 yards as the Packers only managed to put up 20 points. That made them 0-2 against the 49ers in the postseason, and the same schematic flaws kept biting them because the coaching staff never found a real solution. That brings us into 2014, which is where the story becomes truly painful for Packers fans. Aaron was back in MVP form, throwing for 38 touchdowns and only 5 interceptions for a 112 passer rating. He was untouchable at home, throwing 25 touchdowns and 0 picks at Lambeau during the regular season. By almost every metric, this was the most efficient version of a quarterback we had ever seen. Yet the season ended in a way that people can still barely talk about 10 years later. They managed to survive the divisional round against Dallas after Dez Bryant had a catch overturned on a crucial 4th down. It was a controversial call that changed the entire game in NFL forever, but the Packers moved on to face Seattle in the NFC Championship game. With under 5 minutes left in that game, Green Bay held a 19-7 lead. For the Seahawks to win, they needed a touchdown, a successful onside kick, a 2-point conversion, and then another score to tie or win. All 4 of those things had to go perfectly for Seattle to have a chance, and all of those things happened. After a Seahawks score, Brandon Bostic was a tight end who wasn't even supposed to be the primary guy on the onside kick unit. He was supposed to block, but instead he jumped for the ball and let it slip through his hands. Seattle recovered the ball and scored again, forcing Aaron Rodgers back on the field to force OT. Luckily, he did. Russell Wilson got the ball first, and he was having an awful game, but he threw the game-winning touchdown pass in overtime. Aaron never even got to touch the ball in that extra period, and the final score sat at 28-22. The 2011 loss was a slow burn caused by an incomplete roster, but this loss was totally different because you could point to one specific moment. It came down to one player making one mistake, and that's how thin the margin for error is at this level. The reality was that Green Bay had a quarterback who could win a game against almost anyone, anywhere. The problem was that the team around him was only good enough to get to the doorstep without ever actually walking through it. The 2015 season was the first real year that Aaron Rodgers actually started to look human, by his standards. His completion percentage dropped and he sat at a 92.7 passer rating, but he still managed to scrap his way into the playoffs and they faced Arizona for the first time in a long time. That game in regulation ended on a wild Hail Mary off an absolute dime from Aaron Rodgers. The Cardinals eventually won in overtime, but it didn't feel like a total joke job as much as it felt like a team that had hit their ceiling. They were running the same old scheme against better opponents and the rest of the league was finally starting to figure them out. Then 2016 arrived, and for a minute there, it looked like the franchise was going to get the spark it needed. Green Bay stumbled out of the gate to a 4-6 start, Rodgers looked shaky, and the entire offense seemed completely out of sync. For the first time since he took over the starting job, people were actually making a real argument that maybe he had actually lost a step. That changed when he went on a radio show and told the world the Packers could run the table. Everyone thought he was crazy, but he led the team to 6 straight wins to finish the regular season, throwing 15 touchdowns and 0 interceptions during that run to get Green Bay back into the playoffs at 10-6. They are the hottest team in football, and that led them to a wild-card win over the Giants, which was pretty routine. But the divisional round against the top-seeded Cowboys is the game everyone still talks about. The score was tied at 31 with only a few seconds left on the clock when Aaron Rodgers took a snap and got flushed out to his left. He launched a 36-yard strike down the sideline to Jared Cook, who somehow managed to get both feet in bounds by an inch. Mason Crosby stepped up and nailed the field goal as time expired to win it, and then the team went on to go against Atlanta. The Falcons had one of the most dominant offenses in the history of the league that year, with Matt Ryan being the MVP and Julio Jones being impossible to cover. Green Bay had no answer for what Atlanta was doing on offense, and the NFC Championship quickly turned into a 44-21 blowout. Aaron threw 2 interceptions while the defense gave up a bunch of points, but this wasn't a collapse like the one in Seattle. Green Bay simply wasn't as good as Atlanta that year, and the final score showed it. What happened next is when the whole era started to feel like it was falling apart. Aaron broke his collarbone 6 weeks into the 2017 season, and without him on the field, the Packers finished a dismal 7-9. They were a bad football team without their star, which really showed you how thin the roster was underneath the quarterback. When 2018 rolled around, he came back perfectly healthy and threw for over 4,400 yards with only 2 interceptions. It was one of the cleanest statistical seasons he had in terms of protecting the ball, but Green Bay still went 6-9-1 and missed the playoffs for the second year in a row. That failure is what got Mike McCarthy fired. The organization made the call in Week 15 after a loss to Arizona, which was a move they had honestly probably been weighing for 2 or 3 seasons already. The Aaron Rodgers era was running on fumes and it desperately needed a shock to the system. Matt Lafleur took over in 2019 and the results were almost instant. They made it all the way to the NFC Championship game because of his younger offensive-minded system and more pre-snap motion to adjust to what Rodgers can now do in his late 30s. Green Bay finished 13-3 in that first season under Lafleur and earned a first-round bye, which made it look like the organization had finally found the reset they needed. Then they traveled to San Francisco for the NFC Championship and got absolutely dismantled. The final score was 37-20, but the game wasn't even as close as the scoreboard made it look. The Packers didn't score a single point in the first half, going down 27-0 because Kyle Shanahan's defense knew exactly how to knock Rodgers off his rhythm. He finished with 326 yards and 2 scores, but the Packers couldn't stop the 49ers run game. That made 3 straight losses to San Francisco in the postseason. And what happened next is where the story really gets messy. In April of 2020, the Packers decided to trade back up into the first round to draft Jordan Love, a quarterback out of Utah State. Aaron found out by watching the draft on TV just like everybody else. Nobody had consulted him or even gave him the heads up that it was happening. He called the move disrespectful, and he was absolutely right to feel that way. You can understand the front office's logic if you look at it from a distance, since Rodgers was 36 and the window was going to close eventually. They didn't want to wait until the last second to find a successor, but the timing of the move was incredibly tone-deaf. You don't spend a first-round pick on a replacement without talking to your star first, especially when that pick could have been used on a receiver or a lineman to help the team win right now. Green Bay chose to focus on the future instead of the present, and Aaron heard that message loud and clear. He decided to respond the only way he knew how. The 2020 season was arguably the best football Aaron has played in his entire life. He put up 48 touchdowns against only 5 interceptions and completed over 70% of his passes. His passer rating was 121.5, which was the second highest mark in history behind his own legendary 2011 season. His connection with Davante Adams reached a level that the franchise had never seen before between quarterback and wide receiver. Green Bay finished 13-3 to earn the top seed in the NFC, and Rodgers walked away with his 3rd MVP trophy. It was a season that felt more like a direct message to the front office: if you want to move on, you're going to have to wait. Then came the game against Tampa Bay. In that NFC Championship game, Rodgers threw for 346 yards and 3 more touchdowns, while playing under constant fire from the Buccaneers pass rush. With about 3 minutes left and the score at 31-23, Green Bay had a 1st and goal from the 8-yard line with a chance to tie it. Lafleur called 3 straight passes, and when none of them really worked, the Packers decided to kick a field goal to make it 31-26. Tampa got the ball back and simply ran out the clock. Those 3 passes from the 8-yard line and the decision to kick a field goal while trailing became the go-to example for every criticism of Lafleur's postseason coaching. Rodgers followed that up with back-to-back MVP seasons. In 2021, he won his 4th trophy by throwing for 37 touchdowns and only 4 interceptions. The Packers went 13-4 and took the top seed in the NFC for the 2nd year in a row, entering the playoffs as heavy favorites with home field advantage. Everything was lined up for a Super Bowl run. San Francisco came into Lambeau as a 6th seed that had barely made the playoffs, but the Packers lost 13-10. Aaron didn't throw a single touchdown, and a blocked punt return for a score ended up being the difference in the game. He became the first quarterback in the history of the NFL to lose 4 straight playoff games to the same team. He had just spent 2 years as the best player in the league, but it resulted in 2 straight exits before making a Super Bowl appearance. The math just wasn't adding up anymore, and the organization decided the only answer was to redo his contract, restructure their roster, and try this whole last thing one more time. The 2022 season kicked off with a massive hole in the roster. Aaron had spent that offseason contemplating retirement, and while he was doing that, Davante Adams had spent years making his connection with Rodgers look like a video game cheat code, but he was over it. And midway through the offseason, he was traded to Las Vegas. While the front office brought back draft capital in the deal, when Rodgers decided he was coming back, they left him with a receiving core made up of young, unproven players who were suddenly expected to carry a high-level offense. The situation got even more difficult when Aaron spent the majority of the year playing through a broken thumb on his throwing hand. The Packers limped to an 8-9 finish, and Rodgers struggled to find his rhythm, finishing with 26 touchdowns and 12 interceptions. That was the worst ratio of his entire career as a starter, falling behind his first year in the league and even previous injury-plagued seasons. Everything came to head in the worst possible way during a Week 18 matchup at Lambeau Field. They were facing the Detroit Lions, a team that had been eliminated from the playoffs just hours before kickoff. Green Bay controlled their own destiny and only needed a win to get into the postseason, but the game slipped away when it mattered the most. With the season on the line, Aaron dropped back on 3rd down and threw a late interception to Kirby Joseph that effectively ended the game. He walked off the field slowly, heading straight for the tunnel. That specific image of a 39-year-old Rodgers walking away with Randall Cobb after a loss to an eliminated rival is the real closing shot of his time in Green Bay. It isn't the confetti falling or that legendary sideline throw to Jared Cook against the Cowboys. The era ended with a quiet walk into the tunnel at Lambeau Field after the Lions sent him home. The Packers wasted one of the best primes in NFL history point blank. There's no reason he should have the same number of Super Bowl appearances and Super Bowl MVPs as Nick Foles. Shout out to him though. Aaron Rodgers will go down as one of the most gifted passers to ever step onto a football field. When it comes to his touch, his arm strength, or his uncanny ability to make accurate throws from angles that shouldn't even be possible, he's arguably the best to ever do it. He can improvise and extend plays better than almost anyone we've ever seen. The hardest part for fans is that Green Bay was actually never bad. They were just good enough every single year to make you believe that this time would maybe be different, even though it never was after that first chip. They finished his era with 4 MVPs, 11 playoff wins, and 1 Super Bowl, but it all ended with a lonely walk into a tunnel after losing to a team that had nothing to play for. So there you have it. Subscribe if you're new and watch this next video if you haven't already. Thanks for watching.